The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital hummed with indifferent persistence, casting their pale glow over the third-floor nursing station at 6:17 in the morning. Claire Hadley stood at the medication cart with both hands pressed, flat against the cool steel surface, her eyes moving rapidly between the printed chart in her hand and the small plastic cups arranged before her. She was 24 years old, 7 weeks into her first real nursing position, and she had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in the past 3 days. Her hair, the color of dark honey, her mother always said, was pulled back in, a tight bun that had begun to loosen at the temples. She wore no makeup. There had been no time for makeup since orientation ended. There had barely been time to eat, to call her parents back in Dayton, to remember who she had been before she became this version of herself. Scrubs the color of slate blue, stethoscope perpetually cold against her collarbone, a lanyard bearing her ID photo in which she looked startlingly young and startlingly hopeful. She still felt the hope. That was the embarrassing part. Even now, even exhausted, she still felt it. Hadley, the voice came from behind her, clipped and certain, the way a door sounds when it's shut rather than closed. Room 14 is asking for his pain medication. That should have gone out 12 minutes ago. Claire didn't flinch. She had learned, over 7 weeks, not to flinch visibly. I'm pulling it now. Charge Nurse Delaney. He was flagged for a medication. Interaction review. Dr. Okafor left a note last night asking us to hold the oxycodone pending his morning rounds. Sandra Delaney was 51 years old and had been a nurse for 27 of them. She had the posture of someone who had been right about things too many times to bother being gentle about it anymore. She was not cruel. Exactly. She was efficient. In the way that efficiency, taken to its extreme, begins to resemble cruelty. I see no such note, Sandra said. It's in the system, not the paper chart. Dr. Okafor entered it at 11:48 p.m. A pause. Sandra moved to the computer terminal, her fingers moving with practiced speed. The pause became slightly longer than it should have been, which was the closest Sandra Delaney ever came to conceding a point. Fine, she said finally. But room 9 needs a dressing change, and I need you on the floor, not standing here reorganizing. Medications like you're putting together a puzzle. Yes, ma'am. Claire wheeled her cart down the hallway. Room 9 was Mr. Gerald Whitmore, 68 years old. Edmund for a post-surgical wound that refused to close with the speed that his impatience demanded. He complained about everything, the food, the temperature, the angle of the television. But he never complained about Claire, which she had come to understand was its own kind of compliment. Room 14 was different. Room 14 was James Calloway. She had read his chart the night before her first shift, caring for him, the way she read every patient's chart thoroughly, with a yellow legal pad nearby for notes, a habit from nursing school that the other nurses found alternately endearing and excessive. James Calloway, 53 years old. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Retired Army Staff Sergeant, admitted following a severe flare-up of a chronic pain condition rooted in a spinal injury sustained during his second deployment, compounded by what the admitting physician had diplomatically described as significant psychological burden. He had been at Mercy General for 11 days. In those 11 days, he had refused physical therapy twice, declined a consultation with the hospital's social worker, and sent back for consecutive meal trays, untouched. He spoke to the nursing staff in monosyllables. He kept the blinds in his room drawn at all hours, so that the space existed in a permanent dim twilight that smelled of antiseptic and something older, something that Claire, who'd grown up around her grandfather's workshop, would only describe as the smell of a man who had put down something heavy and not yet decided whether to pick it back up. She had not been afraid of him. That was perhaps her first mistake. In Sandra Delaney's estimation, her second mistake, the one that had apparently set the current catastrophe into motion, had occurred 4 days ago. She had knocked on his door at 7 in the morning with his medication, and he hadn't answered. She knocked again. Still nothing. The protocol was clear. Document, notify the charge nurse, wait. But something she still couldn't explain it rationally, which was why it kept being used against her. Something had made her open the door. He was sitting in the chair beside the window with the blinds open for the first time, staring at the parking lot below with an expression she recognized from the faces of people she had seen in photographs, in documentaries, in the careful language of textbooks, an expression of total, absolute absence. Like a house with all the lights off. She had not followed protocol. She had pulled a chair beside him and sat down, and she had said, quietly, I'm not going anywhere for a few minutes if that's okay. He hadn't responded. She had sat with him for 11 minutes, she knew, because she checked her watch when she left. And then she had administered his medication and charted the delay and gone on with her morning. She had thought nothing more of it, but Sandra Delaney had reviewed the timestamps. Sandra Delaney had cross-referenced the medication log against the patient interaction notes, and Sandra Delaney had, this morning, left a message with the director of nursing requesting a formal review of Claire Hadley's clinical judgment and protocol compliance. The message had been forwarded to Claire at 6 a.m. Just before her shift began, she had read it standing in the parking garage, the Ohio spring air cold enough to show her breath, and she had stood there for a moment watching that small cloud of warmth dissolve into nothing. Then she had gone inside, because there were patients who needed her, because she had not come this far to turn around in a parking garage, and because somewhere on the third floor, in a room with the blinds now habitually open since that morning 4 days ago, James Calloway was waiting for his medication. She told herself. That part didn't matter. She was not entirely convincing. The formal review was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Claire learned this not from Sandra Delaney, who communicated with her only through the medium of assigned tasks and pointed silences, but from Kevin Marsh, one of the 2 male nurses on the floor, who had the particular gift of knowing everything that happened at Mercy General, approximately 40 minutes before it happened. Pendleton's going to be there, Kevin said, refilling his coffee in the break room while Claire ate a granola bar standing up, because sitting felt like surrender. HR is sending somebody too. And Delaney? Obviously. Patricia Pendleton was the director of nursing. Claire had met her once, during orientation. A composed woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the considered manner of someone who had seen enough to be neither surprised nor easily moved. What are the odds? Claire asked. Kevin looked at her with the apologetic honesty of someone who genuinely liked her. Headley, you left a patient unmedicated for 11 minutes without notifying the charge nurse. On paper, that's a protocol breach. He wasn't in distress from the delay. It's a medication window, I know, but Delaney wrote it up as a judgment call that put the patient at risk, and Pendleton has to take that seriously. He paused. Is there anything that actually happened in that room that would change the picture? Anything documented? Claire thought. About the 11 minutes. The parking lot light, gray and flat, through the opened blinds. The way James Calloway had sat with his hands on his knees, perfectly still, like something that had forgotten how to move. The way she had not tried to fill the silence because the silence had not felt like emptiness. It had felt like pressure, like a held breath, and she had understood without being told that disturbing it wrongly would be worse than leaving it alone. Nothing documented, she said. Kevin nodded once. The way people nod when they've confirmed something they already knew. She spent the hours between 6:30 and 10 moving through her rounds, with a concentrated deliberateness of someone who understands they are being observed. She was being observed. Sandra Delaney had a particular quality of peripheral attention that made itself felt without ever becoming overt. A supervisory awareness as constant and impersonal as the fluorescent lights. Above. Claire changed Mr. Whitmore's dressing in room 9. She administered morning medications in rooms 11, 12, and 13. She updated charts, answered call lights, spoke with a patient's daughter who had driven through the night from Pittsburgh and needed someone to explain, slowly and without condescension, what stable but guarded actually meant for a 70-year-old man with compromised kidneys. And then she knocked on the door of room 14. Come in, James Calloway said. He was in the chair again. The blinds were open. He had been eating more in the last 4 days, not enthusiastically, but consistently, which the dietitian had noted with something close to relief. He was a large man made somehow smaller by the hospital setting, the way all large men are diminished by institutional furniture and paper gowns. His hair was gray at the temples, cut short from a habit that had outlasted his service. His eyes were blue and very direct, the kind of eyes that had spent years learning to assess situations quickly. Morning medication, Claire said, bringing the small cup to his tray table. He took it, looked at it, then looked at her. You seem like you've got something on your mind, he said. It was the longest sentence he had voluntarily offered her in the 11 days since his admission, and it arrived with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to reading people the way others read. Whether she considered deflecting, it would have been the professional choice. I have a review this morning, she said instead, because James Calloway's eyes were the kind that made deflection feel more exhausting than honesty. About the morning I came in and sat with you. I didn't follow protocol. It was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cart rattled down the hallway. Someone on another floor called a name twice. Why'd you do it? He asked. Sit with me. She thought about how to answer that. Because you looked like someone who needed another person in the room, she said. Not to talk, just in the room. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange sensation of being read, not assessed for a threat or competence, but genuinely read, the way you read something you want to understand. What time is the review? He said. 10 o'clock. He nodded once, slowly, and turned back to the window. She charted the medication and left. At 9:53. She was standing outside the conference room at the end of the third-floor administrative corridor, her hands clasped in front of her, her face arranged into the expression of composed attentiveness. She had been practicing since 6 a.m. The door was closed. Through the narrow rectangular window she could see the edge of the table, the corner of Patricia Pendleton's blazer, the back of Sandra Delaney's chair. She heard the elevator at the far end of the hall. She looked up. James Calloway was walking toward her. He was wearing the hospital-issued robe over his gown. His feet in the non-slip socks, they gave all patience, and he was moving with the careful, deliberate gait of a man managing pain that he had decided, for the moment, not to be managed by. He had not, to anyone's knowledge, left his room under his own power since his admission 11 days ago. He walked the full length of the corridor without stopping and came to stand beside her, outside the conference room door. "What are you doing?" she said quietly. "Going to a meeting," he said. "Mr. Calloway, you should be in bed. I've been in bed for 11 days. He looked at the door. "You got a piece of paper? A pen?" She found both in her pocket. She always had both. He took them from her and wrote something, slowly and carefully, in the deliberate handwriting of someone who doesn't write often but means every word when they do. He folded the paper once and handed it back to her. "Give that to whoever's running the meeting," he said, "before they start." She looked at the folded paper in her hand. "And if they won't take it?" she asked. "I'll walk in there and say it myself," he said. And there was something in his voice, not loudness, not anger, something quieter and more immovable than either that made her believe him completely. Patricia Pendleton had been director of nursing at Mercy General for 9 years, and in that time she had conducted 41 formal staff reviews. She had learned to read the shape of a meeting before it began, the seating arrangements, the quality of the silence, the way people held their coffee cups. That this morning, Sandra Delaney had arrived first and taken the chair to the left of the head of the table, which was Sandra's habitual position of authority. Margaret Cho from Human Resources sat to the right with a legal pad and a pen. Patricia herself sat at the head. The case file was open in front of her. She had read it twice. Claire Headley, 7 weeks post-hire, strong evaluations from 3 supervising nurses and 1 attending physician during orientation, 0 prior disciplinary note. The incident in question was documented clearly. 11-minute medication delay. No charge nurse notification. No documented justification in the patient notes. The door opened. Claire Hadley entered. She was younger than Patricia sometimes forgot. Not young in a way that implied incompetence, but young in the way that certain people are who have not yet learned to hide the fact that things matter to them. She was pale. She held herself well. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table in front of Patricia without explanation and sat down. Patricia looked at the paper. Then she looked at Claire. "This is from your patient," she said. "Room 14, James Calloway. He asked me to give it to you before the meeting started." Patricia unfolded the paper. She read it. She read it again. The room was quiet. Sandra Delaney leaned forward slightly, trying to read the paper from across the table, and Patricia tilled it, not rudely, but deliberately, so that the writing was visible only to her. She set it down. She folded her hands on top of it. "Mr. Calloway wrote this himself," she said. Double quotes.
"Yes."
"This morning, yes. He was standing in the hallway outside when I arrived." A short silence. Sandra Delaney said, "Whatever the patient wrote, the protocol breach is documented, Sandra." Patricia's voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "Give me a moment." She read the note a third time. James Calloway's handwriting was plain and deliberate. He had not written much. He was not, you could tell from the note, a man who used more words than necessary. But the words he had used were precise, and they described the morning 4 days ago with a clarity and specificity that no chart entry could have captured. Not because Claire Hadley had failed to document it, but because what had happened in that room was not the kind of thing that fit inside a documentation field. He wrote that he had been awake since 3 a.m. He wrote that he had been in a state that he did not describe in clinical terms, but which Patricia, with her years of nursing experience before moving to administration, recognized immediately. He wrote that when the nurse had entered the room without being invited and sat down without being asked and stayed without being needed in any practical sense, something had shifted. Not fixed. He was careful to say not fixed, but shifted. The way a stone that has been pressing on something can be moved a few inches without being removed entirely. Enough to let blood flow back into a place that had gone numb. He wrote that in his opinion, which he acknowledged was only his opinion. The nurse had done the right thing. He wrote that the right thing and the protocol thing were not always the same thing, and that in his experience, confusing the two had cost more lives than it had saved. He signed it, James Calloway, SSGT, U.S. Army, retired. Patricia looked up at Claire Hadley. "Tell me what you saw," she said, "when you walked into that room." Claire told her. She spoke without notes, without the careful hedging of someone trying to minimize liability, and without the performed emotion of someone trying to win sympathy. She spoke like a nurse describing a patient's condition, which is what she was doing, Patricia realized. She had assessed the situation, made a clinical judgment, and intervened. The intervention was not in any textbook, it was not billable, it would not appear in any outcome metric. But it was nursing. Patricia had known that since her second year on the floor. 30 years ago, when she had sat with a dying man for 20 minutes, past the end of her shift because there was no one else in. He was afraid of the dark. She had been written up for it. The charge nurse at the time, a woman not unlike Sandra Delaney. though Patricia would never say so aloud, had called it a failure to maintain professional boundaries. She had kept the write-up in her desk for 3 years, in the bottom drawer, as a reminder of something she was still working to articulate. Sandra, Patricia said, what is a protocol for a nurse who believes a patient may be at risk of self-harm or acute psychological distress? A pause. To notify the charge nurse and remain with the patient. To remain with the patient, Patricia, repeated Claire in your assessment of Mr. Calloway that morning. Did you believe he was at risk? Claire met her eyes.
Yes.
And you remained with him? Yes. Did you notify the charge nurse? No. I know. I made a judgment that leaving to make a call would disrupt that judgment is debatable, Patricia said. And we will discuss it, and we will document our discussion, and you will be counseled on communication and escalation protocol. That conversation needs to happen. G paused. But a counseling session is not a termination proceeding, and I want to be clear about what this meeting is and is not. Sandra Delaney's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Patricia, the request I submitted was for a formal review of clinical judgment, which is what this is. Patricia closed the file. And my judgment, having reviewed the clinical record and the patient's own account, is that Claire Hadley exercised imperfect protocol in the service of sound clinical instinct, and that the appropriate response is structured mentorship, not termination. She looked at Margaret Cho. I don't think we need HR for the remainder of this conversation. Thank you for your time. Margaret Cho, who had written nothing on her legal pad, nodded, gathered her things, and left with the brisk relief of someone excused from a situation they were glad not to adjudicate. Patricia turned back to Claire. You will write a full incident report. You will meet with me and your charge nurse twice in the next 2 weeks to review your escalation protocol. And you will do all of this while continuing to provide excellent care to your patients. She paused. Are we clear? Yes, Claire said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, Patricia noticed, were not quite good. Patricia stood. Sandra, I'll see you at 11 for our standing meeting. Sandra Delaney left the room without speaking. Patricia Pendleton waited until the door closed. Then she looked at Claire Hadley, and for a moment she allowed herself to set down the director of nursing and speak as something older and more essential. That instinct you had, she said quietly, the one that told you to stay? Don't let anyone train it out of you. Learn the protocol, learn it cold, know it in your sleep. But don't let the protocol convince you that it's the same thing as the care. She picked up James Calloway's note. And go tell your patient he can go back to his room. Claire found him in the hallway where she had left him, standing beside a window that looked out over the hospital's interior courtyard, where a few small trees had begun to show the pale, tentative green of early spring. He was leaning slightly against the wall, the careful lean of someone managing discomfort without advertising it. You should sit down, she said. I've been sitting down for 11 days. You've also had spinal surgery and a documented pain flare. Those things don't care how long you've been sitting? He looked at her sideways. How'd it go? I still have my job. She came to stand beside him at the window. I'm getting a formal counseling session and 2 weeks of close supervision. That sounds about right, he said. You didn't have to do that. Write the note. I know. It meant a lot. She stopped. Started again. Thank you. He was quiet for a moment. Below, in the courtyard, a maintenance worker was doing something to one of the young trees, staking it. Claire realized, tying a loose guide wire back to the support post that had come free over the winter. I did 3 tours. James said. He said it the way people say things they have said many times, in their heads and very few times out loud. He came back all 3 times. The last time, I came back and I couldn't figure out what I'd come back to. That's the part nobody tells you about. The coming back part. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned something about silence. Sitting in his room 4 days ago? I have been in this bed, this hospital, because it felt like the only place I had a reason to be horizontal. A reason to stop. He looked at the courtyard. That morning you came in. I was sitting there thinking about the parking lot. Counting cars. He stopped. It's hard to explain. You don't have to explain it. I know I don't. He looked at her. But I want to, because you stayed, and nobody stays. My ex-wife stayed as long as she could, and I don't blame her. My daughter calls every Sunday, and I love her for it, but I can hear her wondering what to say. Niva has a therapist who's fine. Good man. Does his best. But there's something about being sat with by someone who doesn't need anything from you, who doesn't have a form to fill out. He paused. You just sat there. You looked like you needed someone to sit there. I turned back to the window. I did. Below, the maintenance worker had finished with the tree. He stood back and looked at it, making sure it was straight, checking the tension of the wire, and then he moved on to the next one. I've been thinking, James said, about what comes next. The discharge plan. The VIA therapist asked me last week, and I gave him the standard answer. Go home, manage the pain, check in weekly. But I've been thinking there might be more to it than that. That sounds like progress, Claire said carefully. Don't do that. What? The nurse voice. The careful one. She almost smiled. Sorry. No, you're not. There was something in his voice, now that hadn't been there in 11 days, something lighter, not quite humor but adjacent to it, like a window cracked open. You've got a good instinct, Hadley. I said it in the note, and I'll say it to your face. You're going to be a good nurse. I almost got fired this morning. Almost isn't fired. He pushed off the wall, slowly, steadying himself. The best soldiers I served with weren't the ones who followed every order perfectly. They were the ones who knew why the orders existed, and knew when they didn't apply. She thought about what Patricia Pendleton had said. Learn the protocol cold, but don't let it convince you that it's the same thing as the care. Let me get you a wheelchair, she said, to get back to your room. He considered this for a moment. She could see him weighing his pride against his spine, and then he nodded. Yeah, all right. She went to the supply alcove and came back with the chair. He lowered himself into it with the careful economy of someone who would learn to do difficult things without making them look difficult. She wheeled him back down the corridor. The physical therapist is coming at 2, she said. You've canceled twice. I know. Are you going to cancel again? No. She stopped the wheelchair at the door of room 14. He didn't get up immediately. The room was dim with the blinds half open, the spring light coming in at a low angle. That made the dust motes visible and turned the ordinary space into something almost gentle. Why'd you become a nurse? He asked. She thought about the real answer, the one beneath the version she gave at job interviews. Her grandfather, who had died when she was 12, tended in his last weeks by a hospice nurse named Barbara who had the same quality. Claire had always struggled to name a quality of full presence, of being entirely there, no part of her, saved for somewhere else. Claire had watched Barbara work and felt something clarify inside her, the way a photograph clarifies in a developing bath. Slow, then, all at once. Someone showed me what it looked like to really be with a person, she said, when it mattered. He looked up at her. The blue eyes, direct as ever. That's what you did, he said. That morning, I learned it from someone else. Maybe you passed things like that along. He nodded once. Then he pushed himself up from the wheelchair and moved through the door into his room, and she watched him cross to the chair by the window, his chair. The one that had become his, the way certain spaces become certain people's, and sit. Donnie didn't close the blinds at 2 o'clock. When she looked in before the end of her shift, the physical therapist was there. James Calloway was standing, actually standing, weight distributed, working through something painful and deliberate, his jaw set. The therapist was talking. James was listening. He glanced at the door. He saw her. He gave a single nod, small and certain, the kind of nod that means, I've got this. The kind of nod that costs something to give and means more for the cost. She nodded back. Then she went to chart her notes, to complete her incident report, to do all the careful, necessary, documented work that the job required, the work that mattered and needed to be done. And she carried with her, down the hallway, into the elevator, out to the parking garage where the Ohio Spring was softening the air in small and promising degrees. The knowledge that the work that couldn't be charted mattered too, maybe mattered most. She drove home. Called her mother. She slept for 7 hours straight, which was more than she had managed in weeks. She came back the next morning. She always would.